Good morning. This is Tuesday, July the 9th. And we're still reading the Celestine Prophecy by James Redfield. And we will continue where we left off and continue reading. Father Carl smiled. Exactly. You can take my truck. I nodded and we walked around to the front of the house where the vehicles were parked. My things, along with a supply of food and water, were already packed in Father Carl's truck. Father Sanchez's vehicle was also packed. I wanted to tell you this, Sanchez said. Remember to stop as often as necessary to reconnect your energy. Stay full. Stay in a state of love. Remember that once you achieve this state of love, nothing nor anyone can pull more energy from you than you can replace. In fact, the energy flowing out of you creates a current that pulls energy into you at the same rate. You can never run out, but you must stay conscious of this process in order for it to work. This is especially important when you interact with people. He paused. Simultaneously, as if on cue, Father Carl walked closer and said, "You have read all but two insights, the seventh and the eighth. 7 deals with the process of consciously evolving yourself or staying alert to every coincidence, every answer the universe provides for you." He handed me a small folder. This is the 7th. It is very short and general, he continued, but it talks about the way objects jump out at us. Go ahead.
Hello?
Yeah,
What did you say?
I said go ahead.
Why?
God, do I have to explain every time I say something? That's the first thing that popped into my head.
I think I gotta go.
All right, well, I'll
See ya.
see you after 11. As the 8th, you will find it yourself when the time is right. It explains how we can aid others as they bring us the answers we seek. And further, it describes a whole new ethic governing the way humans should treat each other in order to facilitate everyone's evolution. Why can't you give me the 8th insight now? I asked. Father Carl smiled and put his hand on my shoulder. Because we don't feel we should. We must follow our intuitions also. We will get the 8th insight as soon as you ask the right question. I told him I understood. Then both priests hugged me and wished me well. Father Carl stressed that we would soon meet again and that I would indeed find the answers I was here to receive. We were all about to board our respective vehicles when Sanchez turned suddenly and faced me. I have an intuition to tell you something. You will learn more about it later. Let your perception of beauty and irresistible scene lead your way. Places and people who have answers for you will appear more luminous and attractive. I nodded and climbed into Father Carl's truck, then followed them down the rocky road for several miles until we came to a fork. Sanchez waved out the back window as he and Father Carl headed east, I watched them for a moment, then turned the old truck north toward the Amazon basin. A surge of impatience rose up within me. After making good time over the 3 hours, I now sat at a crossroads, unable to decide between two particular routes. To my left was one possibility. Judging from the map, this road bore north along the edge of the mountains for 100 miles, then turned sharply east toward Iniquicus. The other route led to the right and maintained an eastern angle through the jungle to the same destination. I took a deep breath and tried to relax, then quickly checked the rearview mirror. No one was in sight. In fact, I hadn't seen anyone. No traffic, no locals walking in over an hour. I tried to shake off a rush of anxiety and knew I had to relax and stay connected if I expected to make the right decision. I focused on the scene. The jungle route to my right progressed between a group of large trees, several huge outcroppings of rocks, punctuated the ground around a large tree. Several huge outcroppings of rock punctuated the ground around them. Most were encircled by large tropical bushes. The other route, though through the mountains, seemed comparatively bare. One tree grew in that direction, but the remainder of the landscape was rocky with very little plant life. I looked to the right again and tried to induce a love state. The trees and the bushes were a rich green. I looked to the left and tried the same procedure. Immediately, I noticed a patch of flowering grass that bordered the road. The blades of grass were pale and spotty, but the white flowers, viewed together, created a unique pattern into the distance. I wondered why I hadn't noticed the flowers earlier. They now seemed to almost glow. I broadened my focus to include everything in that direction. The small rocks and brown patches of gravel seemed extraordinarily colorful and distinct. Hues of amber and violet and even dark red ran through the entire scene. I glanced back to the right to the trees and bushes. Although beautiful, they now paled in comparison to the other route. But how could that be? I thought. Initially, the road to the right seemed more attractive. Glancing back to the left, my intuition strengthened. The richness of sharpened color amazed me. I was convinced. I started the truck and headed to the left, sure of the correctness of my decision. The road was bumpy with rocks and ruts. As I bounced around, my body felt lighter. My weight was centered on my buttocks, and my back and neck were straight. My arms were holding the steering wheel, but were not resting on it. For 2 hours, I drove without incident, nibbling from the food basket Father Carl had packed, and again seeing no one. The road meandered up and down one small foothill after another. At the top of one hill, I observed 2 older cars parked to my right. They were pulled off far to the side of the road in a stand of small trees. I could see no occupants and assumed the vehicles were abandoned. Ahead, the road turned sharply to the left and circled downward into a wide valley. From the peak, I could see for several miles. I stopped the truck abruptly. Halfway across the valley, 3 or 4 military vehicles sat along both sides of the road. A small group of soldiers stood among the trucks. A chill ran through me. That was the roadblock. I backed off the crest and pulled my vehicle behind two large rocks, then got out and walked back to the overlook to again observe the activity in the valley. One vehicle was driving away in the opposite direction. Suddenly, I heard something behind me. I turned around quickly. It was Phil, the ecologist I had met at Vicentia. He was equally shocked. "What are you doing here?" he asked as he rushed up to me. "I'm trying to get to Iquitos," I said. His face was filled with anxiety. "So are we, but the government's getting crazy over the manuscript. We're trying to decide whether to risk passing through the roadblock. There are 4 of us." He nodded to his left. I could see several men through the trees. "Why are you going to Iquitos?" he asked. "I'm trying to find Will. We got separated in Kula, but I heard he might be headed to Iquitos, looking for the rest of the manuscript." He looked horrified. "He shouldn't be doing that. The military has prohibited anyone having copies. Didn't you hear what occurred at Valencia?" "Yeah, some, but what did you hear?" "I wasn't there, but I understand the authorities rushed in and arrested everyone who had copies. All the guests were detained for questioning. Dale and other scientists were taken away. No one knows what happened to them. Do you know why the government is so disturbed about this manuscript?" I asked. "No, but when I heard how unsafe it was getting, I decided to return to Iniquitous for my research data and then to leave the country myself." I told him the details of what had happened to Will and myself after leaving Vicentia, especially the shooting on the ridgetop. "Damn," he said, "and you're still fooling around with this thing?" His statement jarred my confidence, but I said, "Look, if we do nothing, the government is going to suppress the manuscript completely. The world will be denied its knowledge, and I think the insights are important." "Important enough to die for?" he asked. The sound of vehicles attracted our attention. The trucks were driving across the valley toward us. "Oh, shit," he said. "Here they come." Before we could move, we heard the sound of vehicles approaching from the other direction as well. "They've surrounded us," Phil shouted. He looked panicked. I ran to the truck and dumped the basket of food into a small pack. I took the folders containing the manuscript and placed them in the pack as well. Then fell better of it and pushed them under the seat instead. The sounds were growing louder, so I ran across the road to my right in the direction of Phil had headed. Down the slope, I could see him and the others men huddled behind a group of rocks. I hid with them. My hopes was that the military trucks would pass and keep going. My truck was out of sight. Hopefully they would think, as I did, that the other cars were abandoned. The trucks approaching from the south arrived first, and to our horror stopped even with the vehicles. "Don't move, police," a voice shouted. We froze as several soldiers walked up from behind us. All were heavily armed and very cautious. The soldiers searched us thoroughly and took everything, then forced us to walk back to the road. There, dozens of soldiers were searching the vehicles. Bill and his companions were taken and placed in one of the military trucks, which quickly drove away. As he rode past me, I caught sight of him. He looked pale and ghostly. I was led on foot in the opposite direction and asked to sit near the crest of the hill. Several soldiers stood near me, each carrying an automatic weapon on his shoulder. Finally, an officer walked over and tossed the folders containing my copies of the insights on the ground at my feet. On top of them, he threw the keys to Father Carl's truck. "Are these copies yours?" he asked. I looked at him without answering. "These keys were found on you," he said. "Inside the vehicle we found these copies. I ask you again, are they yours?" "I don't think I'll answer until I see a lawyer," I stammered. The remark brought a sarcastic smile to the officer's face. He said something to the other soldiers and walked away. The soldiers directed me to one of the jeeps and into the front seat by the driver. Two other soldiers sat in the back seat, their weapons ready. Behind us, more soldiers climbed aboard a second truck. After a short wait, both vehicles headed north into the valley. Anxious thoughts filled my mind. Where were they taking me? Why did I put myself into this position? So much for the preparation the priest had given me. I hadn't lasted a day. Back at the crossroads I had been so certain. I had chosen the correct road. This route was the one most attractive. I was sure of it. Where did I make my mistake? I took a deep breath and attempted to relax, wondering what would happen now. I would plead ignorance, I thought, and present myself as a misguided tourist, meaning no harm. "I just got mixed up with the wrong people," I would say. "Let me go home." My hands were resting in my lap. They were shaking slightly. One of the soldiers sitting behind me offered a canteen of water, and I took it. Though I could not drink, the soldier was young, and when I handed the canteen back to him, he smiled without a trace of malice on his face. The image of Phil's panicked look flashed across my mind. What would they do with him? The thought occurred to me that meeting Phil on the hilltop had been a coincidence. What was its meaning? What would we have talked about had we not been interrupted? As it was, all I did was stress the manuscript's importance, and all he did was warn me about the danger here and counseled me to get out before being captured. Unfortunately, his advice had come too late. For several hours, we rode without anyone speaking. The terrain outside grew progressively more flat. The air warmed, and at one point the young soldier handed me an open can of sea rations, something like beef hash, but again I couldn't force anything down. After sunset, the light faded quickly. I rode along without thought, staring straight ahead with the truck's headlights. Then I slipped into a restless sleep during which I dreamt of being in flight. I was running desperately from an unknown foe and hundreds of huge bonfires, certain that somehow was a secret key that would open the way to the knowledge and to safety. In the middle of one of the great fires, I saw the key. I darted in to retrieve it. I jerked awake, sweating profusely. The soldiers glanced at me nervously. I shook my head and leaned against the truck's door. For a long time, I looked out the side window at the dark shapes of the landscape. Fighting the urge to panic, I was alone and under guard, heading into dark blackness, and no one cared about my nightmares. About midnight, we pulled up to a large, dimly lit building constructed of cut stone and 2 stories high. We walked along a walkway past the front entrance and entered a side door. Steps led down to a narrow hall. The inner walls were also of stone, and the ceiling was constructed of large timbers and rough-cut planks. Bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling lit our way. We walked through another door and then into an area of cells. One of the soldiers who had disappeared caught up with us and opened one of the cell's doors and motioned for me to enter. Inside were 3 cots, a wooden table, and a vase of flowers. To my surprise, the cell was very clean. As I walked in, young Peruvian, no more than 18 or 19 years old, looked at me meekly from behind the door. The soldiers locked the door behind me and walked away. I sat down on one of the cots as the young man reached over and turned up an oil lamp. When the light hit his face, I noticed that he was an Indian. "Do you speak English?" I asked. "Yes, some," he said. "Where are we?" "Near Polkup." "Is this a prison?" "No, everyone is here for questioning about the manuscript." "How long have you been here?" I asked. He looked up at me with shy brown eyes. 2 months. "What have they done to you?" "They try to make me disbelieve the manuscript and tell about others who have copies." "How?" "By talking to me. Just talking, no threats. Just talking," he replied. "Have they said when they will let you go?" "No." I paused for a moment and he looked at me questionably. "Were you caught with copies of the manuscript?" he asked. "Yes." "Were you?" "Yes. I live near here, in an orphanage. My headmaster was teaching from the manuscript. He allowed me to teach the children. He was able to escape, but I was captured." "How many insights have you seen?" I asked. All that I have been found," he said. "You?" "I've seen all but the 7th and 8th insights. I had the 7th, but I didn't get a chance to read it before the soldiers showed up." The young man yawned and asked, "Can we sleep now?" "Yeah," I said, absently. "Sure." I laid on my cot and shut my eyes, my mind racing. What should I do now? How had I let myself be caught? Could I escape? I concocted several strategies and scenarios before I finally drifted off to sleep. Again, I dreamed vividly. I was searching for the same key, but this time I was lost in a deep forest. For a long time, I had been walking aimlessly, wishing for some sort of guidance. After a while, a huge thunderstorm came and flooded the landscape. During the deluge, I was washed down a deep ravine and into the river, which was flowing in the wrong direction and threatening to drown me. With all my might, I fought against the current, struggling for what seemed like days. Finally, I was able to pull myself from the torrent by clinging to the rocky shoreline. I climbed up the rocks and along the sheer cliffs that bordered the river, ascending higher and higher and into even more treacherous areas. Although I had summoned all my willpower to expertise to negotiate the cliffs, at one point I found myself clinging perilously to the rock face. Unable to proceed any further, I looked down the terrain below me. In shock, I realized that the river had been fighting flow out of the forest and gently up to a beautiful beach and meadow. In the meadow, surrounded by flowers, was the key. Then I slipped and fell, screaming down and down until I hit the river and sank. I sat up quickly in my cot, grasping for air. The young Indian, apparently already awake, walked over to me. "What is wrong?" he asked. I caught my breath and looked around, realizing where I was. I also noticed that the room had a window and that it was already lit outside. "Just had a bad dream," I said. He smiled at me as though he was pleased at what I said. "Bad dreams have the most important messages," he commented. "Messages?" I asked, getting up and putting on my shirt. He looked embarrassed at having to explain. "The seventh insight talks of dreams," he said. "What it does, it says about dreams. It tells how to interpret dreams." "Yes. What does it say about that?" "It says to compare the story of the dream to the story of your life." I thought for a moment, unsure of what that instruction meant. "What do you mean, compare stories?" The young Indian could barely look me in the eyes. "Do you want to interpret your dreams?" I nodded and told him what I had experienced. He listened intently, then said, "Compare parts of the story with your life." I looked at him. "Where do I start?" "At the beginning. What are you doing at the beginning of the dream?" "I was searching for a key in a forest." "How did you feel?" "Lost." "Compare this situation to your real situation." "Maybe it does relate," I said. "I'm looking for some answers about this manuscript, and I'm damn sure feeling lost." "And what else is happening to you in real life?" he asked. "I've been caught," I said. "In spite of everything I tried to do, I've been locked up. All I can hope for now is to talk to someone into letting me go home." "You are struggling against being caught." "Of course." "What happened next in the dream?" "I fought against the current." "Why?" he asked. I began to pick up on where he was headed. "Because at the time I thought it would drown me. And if you hadn't fought the water, it would have carried me to the key." "What are you saying? That if I don't fight against this situation, that I might still get the answers I want?" He looked embarrassed again. "I'm not saying anything. The dream is saying." I thought for a moment. Was this interpretation correct? The young Indian looked up at me, then asked, "If you had to experience the dream again, what would you do different?" "I wouldn't resist the water, even though it looked as though it might kill me. I would know better." "What is threatening you now?" "I guess the soldiers being detained." "So what is the message to you?" "You think the message of the dream is to look at this capture positively?" He didn't answer. He only smiled. I was sitting on my cot, leaning back against the wall. The interpretation excited me. If it was accurate, it would mean that I hadn't made a mistake at the crosswords after all, that this was all part of what should be happening. "What is your name?" I asked. "Pablo," he said. I smiled and introduced myself, then briefly told him the story of why I was in Peru and what had happened. Pablo was sitting on his cot, his elbows resting on his knees. He had short black hair and was very thin. "Why are you here?" he asked. "To find out about the manuscript," I replied. "Why specifically?" he asked again. "To find out about the seventh insight and to find out about some friends, Will and Marjorie. I guess to find out why the church is so against the manuscript." There are many priests here to talk to, he said. I thought about his statement for a moment, then asked, what else does the seventh insight say about dreams? Pablo told me that dreams come to us sometimes about our lives that we are missing. Then he said something else, but instead of listening. I started to think about Marjorie. I could see her face clearly in my mind, and I wondered where she might be. And then I saw her running up to me, smiling. Suddenly, I became aware that Pablo was no longer talking. I looked over at him. Sorry, my mind was wandering, I said. What were you saying? That's all right, he replied. What were you thinking about? Just a friend of mine. It was nothing. He looked as though he wanted to press the question, but someone was approaching the cell door. Through the bars, we could see a soldier sliding back the bolted lock. Time for breakfast, Pablo said. The soldier opened the door and motioned with his head for us to walk into the hall. Pablo led the way down the stone corridor. We proceeded to a stairway and up one flight of stairs to a small dining area. 4 or 5 soldiers stood at the corner of the room while several civilians, 2 men and a woman, waited in line to be served. I stopped, not believing my eyes. The woman was Marjorie. Simultaneously, she saw me and covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes opening wide with surprise. I glanced at the soldier behind me. He was walking toward the other military men in the corner, smiling nonchalantly and saying something in Spanish. I followed Pablo as he led us across the room and to the end of the line. Marjorie was being served. The 2 other men took their trays to a table, talking. Several times Marjorie gazed over and met my eyes, struggling not to say anything. After the second glance, Pablo guessed that we knew each other and looked at me questionably. Marjorie carried her food to a table, and after being served, we walked over and sat with her. The soldiers were still talking among themselves and seemingly oblivious to our movements. God, I'm glad to see you, she said. How did you get here? I hid for a while with some priests, I replied. Then I left to find Will and was captured yesterday. How long have you been here? Since they found me on the ridge, she said. I noticed Pablo was looking at us intently, and I introduced him to Marjorie. I guess that this must be Marjorie, he said. They talked briefly, then asked Marjorie, what else has happened? Not much, she said. I don't even know why I'm being detained. Every day I've been taken to one of the priests or to one of the officers for questioning. They want to know who my contacts were at Valencia and if I know where any other copies are, over and over again. Marjorie smiled and looked vulnerable, and when she did, I felt another strong attraction to her. She looked at me sharply out of the corner of her eyes. We both laughed quietly. A period of silence followed as we ate our food, and then the door opened, and in walked a priest, dressed formally. He was accompanied by a man appearing to be a high-ranking military officer. That's the head priest, Pablo said. The officer said something to the soldiers, who had snapped to attention, and then he and the priest walked across the room toward the kitchen. The priest looked directly at me, our eyes meeting for a long second, and I looked away and took a bite of food, not wanting to attract attention. Both men continued through the kitchen and out a door there. Was that one of the priests you've talked to? I asked Marjorie. No, Marjorie said. I've never seen him. I know the priest, Pablo said. He arrived yesterday. His name is Cardinal Sebastian. I sat up straight. That was Sebastian? It sounds like you've heard of him, Marjorie said. I have, I replied. He's the main person behind the church's opposition to the manuscript. I thought he was at Father Sanchez's mansion. Who is Father Sanchez? Marjorie asked. I was about to tell her when the soldier who had escorted us walked over to the table and motioned for Pablo and me to follow. Time for exercise, Pablo said. Marjorie and I looked at each other. Her eyes revealed an inner anxiety. Don't worry, I said. I'll talk to you at the next meal. Everything will be fine. As I walked away, I wondered if my optimism was realistic. These people could make any of us disappear without a trace at any time. The soldier guided us into a short hall and through a door that led to an outside stairway. He walked down to a side yard which was surrounded by a tall rock wall. The soldier stood by the entrance. Pablo nodded for me to walk with him around the borders of the yard. As we walked, Pablo bent down several times to pick some of the flowers growing in the beds by the wall. What else does the seventh insight say? I asked. He bent down and picked another flower. It says that not only dreams guide us, also thoughts of daydreams guide us. Yes, Father Carl said that. Tell me how daydreams guide us. They show us a scene, a happening, and this is an indication that this event might happen. If we pay attention, then we can be ready for this turn in our lives. I looked at him. You know, Pablo, an image came to me that I would run into Marjorie, and then I did. He smiled. A chill went up my spine. I must indeed be in the right place. I had instituted something that had come true. I had thought several times of finding Marjorie again, and now it had happened. The coincidences were taking place. I felt lighter. I don't have thoughts like that happen very often, I said. Pablo looked away, then said, the seventh insight says that we have many more such thoughts than we realize. To recognize them, we must take an observer position. When a thought comes, we must ask why. Why did this particular thought come now? How does it relate to my life? Questions. Taking this observer position helps us release our need to control everything. It places us in the flow of evolution. But what about negative thoughts, I asked? Those fear images of something bad happening, such as someone we love getting hurt, or of not achieving something we very much want. Very simple, Pablo said. The seventh insight says that fear images should be halted as soon as they come. Then another image, one with a good outcome, should be willed through the mind. Soon negative images will almost never happen. Your intuitions will be about positive things. When negative images come after that, the manuscript says they should be taken very seriously and not followed. For instance, if the idea comes to you that you're going to have a wreck in a truck, and someone comes along and offers you a ride in a truck, then do not accept it. We had come full circle in our walk around the courtyard and were approaching the guard. Neither of us talked as we passed him. Pablo picked a flower and took a deep breath. The air was warm and humid, and the plant life outside the wall was dense and tropical. I had noticed several mosquitoes. Come, the soldier suddenly called out. He prodded us inside and down to our cell. Pablo entered ahead of me, but the soldier put his arm up, blocking my way. Not you, he said, then nodded for me to walk through the hallway and up the other steps and outside through the same door we had entered the night before. In the parking lot, Father Sebastian was entering the back seat of a large car. A driver shut the door behind him. For an instant, Sebastian looked at me again. Then he turned and said something to the driver. The car sped away. The soldier nudged me toward the front of the building. We walked inside and into an office. I was directed to sit in a wooden chair across from a white metal desk. Within minutes, a small, sandy-haired priest of about 30 entered and sat at the desk. Without acknowledging my presence, he looked through a file for a full minute, then looked up at me. His round, gold-rimmed glasses produced an intellectual appearance. You've been arrested with illegal state documents, he said, matter-of-factly. I'm here to help determine whether prosecution is in order. I would appreciate your cooperation. I nodded. Where did you get the translations? I don't understand, I said. Why would copies of an old manuscript be illegal? The government of Peru has its reasons, he said. Please answer the question. Why is the church involved, I asked. Because the manuscript contradicts the traditions of our religion, he said. It misrepresents the truth of our spiritual nature. Where? Look, I said, interrupting. I'm just trying to understand this. I'm just a tourist who got interested in this manuscript. I'm a threat to no one. I only want to know why it is so alarming. He looked puzzled, as if trying to decide the best strategy for dealing with me. I was consciously pressing the details. The church feels the manuscript is confusing to our people, he said carefully. It gives the impression that people can decide on their own how to live without regard to the scriptures. Which scriptures? The commandment to honor thy father and mother, for one. What do you mean? The manuscript blames problems on parents, undermining the family. I thought it spoke of ending old resentments, I said, and finding a positive view of our earlier life. No, he said, it is misleading. There should never have been a negative feeling to begin with. Can't parents be wrong? Parents do the best they can. Children must forgive them. But isn't that what the manuscript is clarifying? Doesn't forgiveness take place when we see the positive about our childhoods? His voice rose with anger. But from what authority does this manuscript speak? How can it be trusted? He walked around the desk and stared down at me, still angry. You don't know what you're talking about, he said. Are you a religious scholar? I think not. Your direct evidence of the kind of confusion this manuscript invokes. Don't you understand that there is order in the world only because of law and authority? How can you question the authorities in this manner? I said nothing, which seemed to infuriate him even more. Let me tell you something, he said. The crime you have committed is punishable by years in prison. Have you ever been in a Peruvian prison? Does your Yankee curiosity yearn to find out what our prisons are like? I can arrange that. You understand? I can arrange that. He put his hand over his eyes and paused, taking a deep breath, obviously trying to calm down. I'm here to find out who has copies, where they are coming from. I will ask you one more time. Where did you get your translations? His outburst had filled me with anxiety. I was making my situation worse with all my questions. What might he do if I failed to cooperate? Still, how could I implicate Father Chances and Father Carl? I need some time to think before I answer you, I said. Momentarily, he looked as if he might fly into another rage. Then he relaxed and looked very tired. I will give you until tomorrow morning, he said, motioning for the soldier standing in the doorway to take me away. I followed the soldier back down the hall and directly to the cell. Without saying anything, I walked over and lay down on my cot, feeling exhausted myself. Pablo was looking out the barred window. Did you talk to Father Sebastian, he asked. No, it was another priest. He wanted to know who gave me the copies I had. What did you say? Nothing. I asked for time to think, and he gave me until tomorrow. Did he say anything about the manuscript, Pablo asked. I looked into Pablo's eyes, and at this time he did not lower his head. He talked a little about how the manuscript undermines traditional authority, I said. Then he started raving and threatening me. Pablo looked genuinely surprised. Did he have brown hair and round glasses? Yes. And I think we're going to stop there. And we'll have to continue this next time, which will be Thursday, I believe. And we'll go from there. And again, as usual, I want to thank everybody who has showed up and does listening to my reading. I have to apologize for my sinus and coughing and all that. It's just me. Anyway, thank you and hope to see you on Thursday. Everybody have a great and wonderful day, and I thank you for all coming. Bye-bye.